MSI has concluded, and I figured that we could do a little bit of a recap or aftermath of what MSI was. Because the big conversation around MSI was initially the lane swaps, right? The lane swap tactic of moving your bot lane to the top. And I think a lot of people are still confused on when exactly you're supposed to do a lane swap or whatnot, or even what the progression was. And I'd just like to point out that actually there was an interesting flavor that was added to what a lane swap can actually be, which is essentially that since you're moving your bot lane top, that means that you get a disadvantage, right? It's essentially a bleed less tactic, which is that since there is tower fortification on the top side of the map, right? Turrets take 50% less damage for the first 5 minutes of the game. Then that means the team that kept their bot lane in the bot lane would be able to take more turret plates and eventually take the turret. And so teams started to realize throughout the progression of MSI that instead what we should do is, if we are the weaker team, let's go ahead and swap our bot lane to the top lane for the first, call it 3 minutes of the game, take maybe one plate or try and get two, and then recall and swap back to the bot lane. So this kind of progression is actually really interesting because essentially what it is it's loss mitigation, right? Because back in the day, it was essentially, okay, let's prevent matching up in the worst 2v2, right? Say they have an enemy Lucian Nami, you're just like, well, fuck, that is like the best bot lane duo as far as the early game is concerned that you can get. So you would then lane swap and everything would be cool because you could just then get the same amount of gold and it's basically a stalemate. But nowadays it's okay, if you do lane swap, you get fucked. So this is a loss mitigation tactic, and I still don't think the general League of Legends, call it pleb fan, understands that. They simply think that a lane swap is very beneficial for the team that is lane swapping, but that's actually not the case. And I like it because we got a different kind of progression of the meta of like, okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to do this hybrid lane swap to where at level 3, once we hit level 3, we're going to go back to the bot lane so that we can then match up against the very aggressive lane. Because usually, typically, the way that a early laning phase goes for the bot lane is that whoever has the more aggressive, a 2v2 can essentially either win out at the level 1 or they definitely win out at the level 2. And so, of course, with the Lucian Nami, that's going to happen at both either level 1 and especially level 2. That's when they really hit their power spike. At level 3, like, yes, that as well too, but you can kind of mitigate that with, this bridging of the gap. And so to where at least level 2, you aren't getting fucking destroyed. And potentially also, and this is crucial here, that you don't get tower dived by the enemy jungler. That's what the huge loss mitigation actually is to prevent the tower dive that will eventually happen once they crash the wave into you. So I think this is just super critical. Teams have realized that, yes, that, call it first wave crash, whenever they hit level 2 or when they hit level 3 even, then you can prevent that and you can prevent the tower dive, which is like incredibly, I guess, brilliant from all the teams to realize, okay, we don't need to do a full, lane swap, call it to, like minute 7 or minute 8, like things in the past. And now we have it to where, of course, Riot is going to try and get rid of lane swaps with the introduction of 75% tower fortification to reduce the damage. So that's essentially to where you might not even be able to get a single plate if you lane swap your bot lane to the top, because the top turret is going to be so strong. So typically what would happen at this MSI was the the team that kept their strong lane, in the bot lane, they would get 2 plates versus the enemy team that swapped would only get 1 plate. So you were only down 1 plate, which isn't that big of a deal. It's not like you can necessarily buy a whole nother item, I think, with that kind of break point. So it wasn't really that bad. But now if you don't get another plate, then you're kind of fucked. So we'll see how that shakes out. I still don't think it's going to prevent the whole lane swap thing. I think what's going to happen is if both your top lane matchup and your bot lane matchup are bad, which theoretically shouldn't happen if the coach is doing their job and, they at least try and get some winning matchups, then typically that's not going to happen. But if it does happen, then you still have the option to lane swap, and it at least will mitigate that loss. But, as previously I said, typically it's only done for the bot lane for the most part. So GENG versus BLG, I think, was surprising, given that I guess people thought that BLG's bot lane of Elk and On were going to absolutely stomp Pays and Lehens. At least that's what we thought in the beginning of the tournament, right? Before any of the matches even happened, we were just like, okay, BLG's bot lane is the strongest bot lane in this entire tournament. Gumayushi and Keria are like, yeah, they're pretty up there too. Maybe they're second best. But it's definitely Elk and On that are going to be like bringing the heat and shit, right? Or even TS bot lane. So really, I think we've kind of put to bed some of the different narratives that have gone on and whatnot. And the entire final, I guess, creates a finality of the entire story, right? We saw that Lehens really picked up with his Blitzcrank in game 2, and that just showcases how good of a support player Lehens actually is, as far as like his roam timing, his ability to be everywhere and anywhere on the map, and to actually realize what advantages that he can get, even just, games not on Blitzcrank, right? We saw that BLG even surprised us against T1 as far as their macro was concerned, because typically what we think when we think of a LPL team is, they're not macro oriented. It's all just about team fight. Like, that's it. But in fact, BLG, we got to see a separate side of that. We got to see, okay, they can actually hang with doing like loss mitigation, or they can hang with doing cross map plays and trying to match T1 1 for 1, right? So we got to see that evolution of like, okay, now we need to update our narrative of what it is of, what we consider an LPL team to be. It's not just that they're super aggressive. It's that, no, they can actually do some pretty good macro. And so the next time that the LCK has to fight against them, they just better be prepared for some actually elegant macro play from the LPL region. But still, GENG just proved above and beyond a shadow of a doubt that they have way better macro than I think any other team in the entire league. Their ability to cross map is just absolutely insane, and they have carried that from 2023 Worlds, where I actually mentioned previously before that GENG was one of the best macro teams, in the entire LCK, right? Back in in LCK summer, they were really fucking good at macro. And, I think a lot of the other teams, especially T1, learned from GENG themselves of how to do really good macro. But I still think GENG was, by far and away one of the best macro teams of the LCK during 2023. But as far as the storylines are concerned, I mean, we got all the storylines that we wanted, right? Chovy finally got his flowers. You had Keen is now recognized as a actually really good top lane talent. I mean, most people outside of watching the LCK didn't even know who Keen was, as far as like the West, but now they do. He's been grinding for years and years and years, and he's been like one of the most, call it, well-rounded players. He's able to play carries, he's able to play tanks and frontline really, really well. Frontline and tank is obviously his forte, but now I think he's proved that he can actually carry games, and that's really cool. That's an updated narrative that we have. I skipped on the Chovy thing, but Chovy now has kind of classified himself as like, yo, I can actually make hard plays in the mid lane. I can actually go and do roams and whatnot, and I can actually do macro plays, versus previously we had thought Chovy was just, oh, I'm just going to play selfishly. I'm going to play for myself, and I'm going to get my CS lead, just stall until late game. No, that's not Chovy anymore. Chovy is like this team player. He's actually able to get his team snowballing and rolling, which is really cool to see. We got to see the Knight versus Chovy matchup finally happen. Just these two massive titans, the LCK MVP and then the LPL MVP, like going head to head against each other. I think that's really fucking cool. Then we got to see, of course, Faker versus Knight again, right? One of the powerhouses in the LPL versus one of the old gods of the LCK, and to see if he still has it. It's like we got to see that matchup. And then, of course, the top lane, right, with Ben versus Zeus. We got to see that of two very aggressive players, and it's like, who's really going to win out? Once again, the LPL versus LCK, and it's like Ben being one of the best top laners in that region for a really long time, as far as the LPL. But I think one of the other big things that we're all seemingly forgetting because of, the whole, I guess, last part of the entire playoffs of MSI was that, dude, talk about the little miracle run that PSG had, right? They knock out FlyQuest, to even get qualified into the bracket stage. And then they had that little miracle run against BLG. It's like, as a, call it minor region, that's really a great accomplishment. And it shows that, dude, Maple has been doing this for fucking years, man. He's been putting people in the dirt forever that have been from major regions and whatnot. And it's just really cool to see, and really cool to see that he still has what it takes to make a team an actual dark horse, no matter what region that he comes from. And then, of course, we got to touch on FlyQuest and the fact that, okay, maybe we need to update that narrative and say, all right, what is actually wrong with FlyQuest? They didn't look good going into the LCS playoffs as far as that was concerned. And then they come over into MSI and then they lose to, call it a minor region. It's like FlyQuest now look like bums and they also looked very desperate. And surprisingly, a lot of their veteran figures just collapsed and underperformed, right? So now we have to look back at that narrative as we head into the LCS summer split. And I think the only thing that I can think of that's really a big storyline that we were missing as far as this tournament was concerned was Rookie, of course, being one of the legendary LPL mid laners, not being able to join, in this great foray of great mid laners at this tournament, but then also, of course, heralded as the best, call it, player in our current day and age of Milky Way, right? We didn't get to see the legendary jungler coming in and fucking popping heads. I've heard a lot about this guy. I haven't really watched any of his games, and I was, like, that would be cool to see him, and cool to see if he actually makes it to Worlds, and cool to see if he actually continues that storyline within the LPL during the summer split. But we actually didn't get to see that. So those are the only two things that I think we missed out on. But as far as I'm concerned, dude, the tournament format was absolutely stunning. I think we got a solid resolution of who is the best team in the world currently right now. I think without a fucking doubt, everyone can say it's GENG, and there's no doubt in anybody's mind. It was no fluke. They clearly made it through, and they clearly were very dominant. So we got a really good resolution. Not only that, but we got to see BLG. BLG is now the second best team in the entire world, right? Like, that's a very solid thing and a solid narrative that we can go into the summer split, and hopefully see if we can continue that for Worlds. And then additionally, besides the awesome fucking format that we have of double elimination, which we should have had a long time ago, was that, dude, we also get to see, more LEC versus LCS. I mean, like, I think it's something ridiculous of we've only got to see such a limited number of best of fives of the LEC versus LCS versus now we get to see that virtually every single time. Like pretty much every single MSI, we're going to be able to see this because, both of the regions are going to be down in the lower bracket eventually. So we're going to be able to see this. And I think that's super fucking sick. We got to see TL versus Fnatic and shit and Fnatic getting stomped on and stuff, but that being very surprising. Like that's a cool storyline that we can then develop going, over into Worlds and whatnot. And although Worlds is now looking like the shittier format, which is unfortunate, but, we get to see more of this format at the next MSI, which is going to be super cool. Now, one big thing that I think we're all missing on that I haven't seen anyone point towards, which is the fact that I think champion pools and the diversity of having a large champion pool is super important. And I think this tournament, MSI, punctuates that specifically. And the fact that you need to be good on more than just the meta champions. Because I think essentially what this tournament has shown is that, it's cool to be like 98% efficient on a meta champion, right? To be like really fucking good. A lot of people are not better than you, or, there's only a couple other people that are 99% or 100% really good at a champion. But I think we saw the effectiveness of having different pocket picks within your arsenal, right? I mean, we saw this with APA and how essentially he was missing he missed Corki. I don't think he played any Corki games. He's missing Azir, obviously. His Azir has always looked bad. And then he's missing Orianna. So it's like, and then we saw how bad that was for Team Liquid with their game against TES where, they fucking drafted the Jin Nami, which is like, that's not even a lane, So we got to see how bad drafting can actually affect a team. We saw that Faker can't play Aurelion Sol. That's just something that's not in his arsenal because it's antithetical to what Faker is, right? Faker, playmaker. Guess what? Aurelion Sol doesn't really make plays. He just follows up on plays, yes, but he doesn't make plays like Azir or he doesn't make plays like Orianna. So, and then you had Karthus being pulled out by Canyon. Like, that was just fucking bizarre. And then, of course, the whole evolution of Nidalee kind of being a tier 1/tier 2-ish pick, or, of course, Canyon picking Kha'Zix as well, even over in the LCK finals. Like, this shit, or like just the champion diversity in MSI was really cool to see, and the evolution of champion diversity. And it actually reminds me a lot of what we would typically see within a Dota tournament, which is that there's seemingly a large amount of hero diversity. I'm not going to say I watch Dota even at all, really, but that's what they're known for, is their hero diversity and the ban phase, and obviously being very important, but also counters. Counters are incredibly important in Dota, and in fact can kind of make or break a game. And I think we saw this on display at MSI of being able to actually expand your playbook to where you can actually get different counter picks and things like that. Chovy playing fucking Yone and shit. Like, these are cool things that we typically don't see within these big international tournaments. And I think it just goes to show that essentially having a bigger champion pool is more important than focusing or hyper focusing on the specific meta champions themselves. I think going forward, that's going to be like a huge thing going into Worlds, 2024, call it. So what did we learn, I think, from MSI going forward, going into summer? What did we learn as far as the meta is concerned? Well, I think one huge thing is that we learned aggression is basically the number one priority that you should have going into game. Like call it 15 seconds into the game. Like, you should just be very aggressive. Start making rotations for ward coverage, right? Start trying to make level 1 plays. Start trying to do invades. Maybe do a lane swap if, your bot lane doesn't have the correct setup or you botched a draft. And then start trying to do tower dives and see different weaknesses across the map, or do some counter jungling to get your jungler ahead. Aggression is the number one thing we can take away from MSI to say, okay, if a team is not aggressive, they're probably not going to win. And we clearly saw that from teams that were very stagnant, kind of like Fnatic, for instance, or FlyQuest, obviously. Loss mitigation is huge, and it was huge at Worlds 2023. But I think MSI definitely punctuates that to say, okay, you actually need to have a game plan as far as how you are going to try and mitigate loss. Because if you don't, you're going to lose the game, right? Because if a team is very aggressive and there is an obvious play on the map, like say Dragon is up or something, and there's clearly a team that wants to start stacking Drakes, and maybe they have the early game team composition, you almost have no chance to fight against that at the Drake fight. So what should you be able to do? Mitigate that loss and say, okay, what's the other obvious idea that we can play on the map? Like, a lot of teams previously weren't doing that. And I think that kind of showed the men from the boys as far as MSI is concerned. So I think we're going to continue to see that trend as far as like the evolution of League of Legends of loss mitigation. And, obviously with lane swaps, that also punctuates that as well too, of, okay, let's swap our bot lane top. It's very smart, and I think a kind of way to, I guess, philosophically expand on League of Legends, or the concept of it as it were, and that going forward. I think we're going to reflect on, kind of call it this era, and see, okay, like loss mitigation, like that's an actual fundamental of League of Legends, at least as far as the professional scene is concerned. And then of course, like I said before, a broader champion pool, I think that helped just massively as far as going into Summer Split, and then of course at Worlds. As League of Legends itself, and here's the thing, as Riot, Riot has obviously shown that their model for monetization within, just call it League of Legends, the game, for plebs and whatnot, not even people in the esport, is they can't stop releasing champions, because champions obviously have skins attached to them, but also, just to purchase the champions, that's how they generate money at Riot Games. So obviously the champions, it's just going to get larger and larger of a champion pool. So you have no choice but to expand your champion pool, because there's going to be so many different niche picks and niche counters that you can do that can then kind of shore up that, call it, the 98% that I was talking about. And I always harken back to this fundamental philosophy of what Dopa was talking about, of like, sometimes it's actually better to have, and like this is the difference between professional play and solo queue, is that in professional play, it's better to have a counter that you are, call it 85% proficient at, rather than being a, call it 3-trick or 4-trick, because guess what? The counter is actually way more easier to pilot, and it's actually easier to abuse the enemy champion that you're countering, even if they're really good at the champion, because guess what? Both of your levels are so high that you're able to exploit those, call it counter situations, and the enemy, no matter how good that they are at their own champion, they can't really mitigate that. So I think we're gonna see that, and unfortunately the LCS is also a best of one region, so that kind of fucking sucks. And the fact that I think it exposed how unfortunate it is that LCS teams can't necessarily practice multiple different champions and whatnot, because first of all, their solo queue kind of sucks and they don't get good practice in solo queue. But secondly, then they don't get good practice in the LCS and they don't get a ton of games to then kind of expand their champion pool. So I think we're going to see kind of the gap express itself more and more. And hopefully LCS teams and players like try and mitigate that, as far as like actually focusing on the champion pools, as it were. But these are the things that I think we can take away from the MSI and going forward into the meta. But as far as I'm concerned, like, this is one of the best tournaments that we've ever had. All the storylines have been completed. All the unanswered questions have been completed. What we can look forward to has been completed. And also what we can look back on and say, okay, like, maybe this is the seed to where we expand our knowledge of what League of Legends philosophy actually is. And like, going forward, maybe what we'll see in the future, because the seeds were planted here. So I think this has actually been a really important tournament. And I think we'll look back and say that actually it was even more underrated than we had initially even assumed.